Continuing with the bucktail streamer series that I'm doing right now to get ready for this class, this is the Little Brown Trout. I have not fished this fly, but I have read a lot about it, and it is supposed to be a very, very good bucktail streamer fly. From a tying standpoint, it was a lot of fun to tie. There's a number of aspects to this fly that just made it really kind of interesting to tie. I think it's a very pretty fly. I think it's a really nice, good-looking pattern. This also is in Mike Valla's book on bucktail streamers. I mentioned it in a video last week. If you did not see that video, there should be a link in the upper left. You can go check that video out. It talks more about the book and the upcoming class that I have. If you're interested in the class, there will be a link in the description down below, so you can find out more about that upcoming class. But this is the Little Brown Trout, and we'll get started tying. We start the Little Brown Trout by putting our hook in the vise. This is a Mustad L87 in a size 6. It's a 5X long streamer hook. You can use any manufacturer's. Basically a 4 to 5, maybe 6X long streamer hook is what's used. We're going to start our thread. I'm using a Danville white 6.0 to begin with. We're going to switch to a black thread later, but because of the body on this, we're going to use a white thread. Just going to attach this right at the point of the hook. That's where we're going to tie in our tail. Now, that's one of the interesting things about this fly, and why I wanted to tie it was when I did some reading and research on it. The tail is actually made up of a small breast feather from a ring-necked pheasant. But the instructions from a number of sources that I read, not only in Mike Valla's book, they mentioned that the length of the tail is to be about the gap of the hook. But you're also supposed to be cutting out the black center section right here of the tail. So when you do that, it gives you a small little hackle like this with that center cut out. The interesting thing is, I don't know, is this all supposed to be clumped together and then tied in, or is it supposed to be tied in and left, splayed out kind of like this? This is how I've been doing it. If anybody out there has more information and would like to share, I'm eager to know if this is the correct way that this is to be tied. From pictures that I've seen, it's hard to determine, because what mostly I've seen is the hackle, or I should say the fly from the broadside right here. I haven't seen it up from the tail, at least from the top. So that's how I've been tying it in. It still gives you a nice tail to it, nice profile. The other interesting thing is I've seen a number of recipes and videos out there where people, they don't even use the pheasant hackle. They just use some brown hackle fibers from, say, a saddle hackle or a Chinese neck or something like that. So you could bunch some of those together and just tie it in. But this is how I've been tying it in. So that is the tail. We're going to put our rib in, and the rib is a Mylar tinsel. If you have a gold metal tinsel, you could use that. I'm using a Danville Mylar tinsel in size 14. I'm going to put this in so that the silver side is up, so then it will flip over to the gold side when we actually put our rib in. I'm going to bring it around to my side here and even to the underside of the hook, and I'm going to get that tip close to the thread. Then I'm going to wrap all the way back down to the tail here, and this is where I'll put in my dubbing. Dubbing for this fly is wool dubbing, and the recipe in Mike Valla's book actually calls for using, you may not get all of that in there, it's a Lion brand dubbing, and it's called Fisherman's wool. So if you're interested, you can get that. I picked some up at Joann's. And you cut it into small half-inch sections, put it in a little coffee grinder, and blend it on up into a nice dubbing. I'll be doing a video later on this year on how to blend your own dubbings. But you could, if you wanted to, just if you didn't have a little coffee grinder or some way of mixing it, you could just separate it in your hand like this and slowly get all the strands separated and mixed up. Or if you wanted, I think you could get by just cutting the yarn off and just wrapping the body in just the yarn if you wanted to. Flatten it out a little bit and put that in. We're going to make a dubbing noodle here that's about 4 to 5 inches long, and it's going to be thin on this end, very sparse on this end up by the hook, so that our body ends up being tapered. It's pretty long because it's a long hook here, so that's why our dubbing noodle is going to be about 4 to 5 inches long. And you're just going to taper it on out on the thread as you're making the dubbing noodle here. I wouldn't get too hung up on making it just perfect. You can actually adjust how the dubbing is applied to the hook a little bit as you're applying it by changing the angle of your thread. And then we can also, if you want, just make it real thin and just go back and forth and put added layers on it to get the profile you're looking for. What we want is a very narrow body back here on up to a wider profile about an eye length from the eye of the hook. That will be the space where we tie in the wing and make the head. But it doesn't have to be super fat. Keep in mind this is supposed to resemble a small brown trout or a bait fish, so it's going to be broader up in the front and narrower in the back. Once you have your dubbing noodle, we just go ahead and apply that to the hook, keeping it thin back here. We want to cover up the hook, don't want any gaps. See, this is why we use the white thread, so that we wouldn't have, because especially being as sparse it is back there, you wouldn't have a black line showing up in the body here. And I really wouldn't get too hung up on making certain that this is just, a perfect, nice, gradual taper. The rib will flatten some of that out. It's wool, so it's going to be sticking out and be kind of buggy. You can see mine wasn't quite long enough, so I'm just going to put a little bit more on here, and I'm trying to keep this relatively sparse so that I can wrap back and forth a little bit if needed to get the profile I'm looking for. One thing you do want to be careful of as you're getting close to the eye up here, you don't want this to be super wide right where you stop, because you're going to be tying in a wing, and if you tie that wing in tight against a thick bit of dubbing here, the wing will tend to want to stick up into the air instead of being a little bit flatter. If you do go too far, you can scooch this back with your thumb a little bit. You just want to make certain that you've got at least an eye length right behind the eye of the hook, if not just a little bit more for the head of the fly and the wing. Once we have our body in, we're going to go ahead and palmer our rib. When you're wrapping this in, I usually get about 7, maybe 8 wraps in. That isn't as important as just making certain that the wraps are evenly spaced. Secure that rib, and then we can cut that off. At this stage, we are done with our white thread. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm using a Danville 6.0 in black for the rest of the fly and for the head of the fly. I'll attach that behind the eye of the hook, wrap that down a little, and I can cut the tag and the white thread off at the same time. Clean this up just a little bit now. I'm ready to go ahead and start my wing. The wing of the little brown trout is comprised of two different colors of bucktail and some squirrel tail fibers. The interesting thing about it and the recipe that was in the book, as well as that I've found online in a number of places, they all talk about the base color for the wing is a yellow bucktail, but then the middle section of the wing is a orangish red bucktail. I have been unable to find a orangish red bucktail simply because most of the ones that I've all seen are either a very bright red or bright orange. So there's a way around that. I'll show you in just a second. I'm going to blend some red and some orange to make that section of it. And then we have some squirrel tail fibers to put in it. But I've gone ahead and cut out some yellow bucktail and already stacked this. When you stack it, don't worry if all of the fibers aren't in a nice crisp edge here. In a way, that's not what you're looking for. But you do want to keep each section sparse. Think of it in this terms of thirds. We have the yellow, we have the orange and red, and then we have the squirrel tail fibers going in. So each one has to be fairly sparse, otherwise we're going to end up with a very large wing on this. I'm going to tie these in so that the wing is just a little bit past the tail. I'm going to wrap these in, take a look, make certain that they're seated well. You can push that down just a little bit to get it to be a little bit more horizontal orientation. And the other pieces of the wing that we tie on here will also help to lay that down a little bit. I want to cut this at an angle so that I have a nice taper coming down to the eye of the hook. Be careful not to get too many thread wraps. Part of the reason we're using a lighter thread because we don't want to get too bulky of a head. Now, as I mentioned, the midsection of this is a red and orange bucktail. I combine them to get my reddish orange bucktail. All I'm doing is I'm cutting out a couple sections of the red and the orange bucktail. I'm going to put those together and then I'm going to roll those in my fingers. So all I'm doing is just rolling those in my fingers like this, or you can roll them like this if you want to. However you do it, you want to, but it's just going to help mix those up. That's the easiest way that I found to get them mixed up, and I don't get too hung up on, you know, that they're 100% evenly blended. If there's a little bit red on one side or a little bit of orange on one side, that's fine. What you're getting is that reddish orange color that's in a brown trout, and you're just getting that mixed up in there. So once you get that mixed up enough, you can put that into your hair stacker, and you're going to go ahead and stack it. And keeping in mind that this also you're going to want sparse. I've already stacked this clump because I don't think you really need to listen to me bang on my desk. You want to keep this to 1/3 the size of the wing. So if need be, you can pluck out a few to thin that down a little bit. Once you have it where you like it, then you're going to tie that in. It's going to be the same length as the yellow. Again, I'm going to put a few wraps to secure that in. Get it nice and up on top. Some flies, like the Mickey fin, is one that you want to make certain you keep the bucktail separate colors so it's more banded. This I don't think is as important if these do kind of get blended a little bit. Again, I'm going to cut this off at an angle here so that we have a taper down to the eye of the hook. Just take your time with it, there's no rush. Come down and clean this up so those are bound down, and I have a nice even platform for the squirrel. Now the squirrel is interesting also because the instructions for the squirrel are to use a hair from the tail of a gray squirrel. There's two different kinds of hair that you're supposed to use. You're supposed to use a medium dark hair and then a dark hair on top of it. I have seen some tails that will have hairs on them that are of different shades on different sides, and that may be what he's talking about in terms of it's a little lighter on the that one side than it is the other side. I'm not certain, but the tail that I have, it's pretty uniform in terms of its color. So what I decided to do is I'm going to put in a little bit of red squirrel, red Fox Squirrel Tail Fibers, not the dark ones on this side of the tail, but the lighter ones here. It gives me a little bit of red, a reddish orange to blend with the bucktail, and but it transitions to the darker gray squirrel. Again, I'm keeping this very, very sparse. I've already prepped some. I only want, 12, 15 fibers of the red squirrel to tie in here. I've already stacked these, and again, I'm not getting too hung up on if they're not, all perfectly even. I'll put that on top, and I'll tie that in. The red squirrel, or I should say the squirrel tail fibers are fairly slick, so you'll want to be careful with that. Maybe put a little wax on your thread. Trim those off, and then I'm going to get some gray squirrel. This also very sparse. I'm just looking for a little bit of transition from the red and orange on up to the back of our fly. That tied in, and clean this up just a little bit. And we have to tie in some jungle cock. You'll want to go ahead and prep your jungle cock nails. I like the longer ones on these streamers than the shorter. You can use some of the smaller nails right here if you want. The jungle cock is basically to look similar to eyes of a fish. It's a target also for fish. They'll see that contrast on the fly. So like I said, you could use some of the smaller nails if you want. I like the longer ones a little bit on long streamer patterns. But we'll go ahead and get those prepped. We're going to tie both of these in at the same time. I'm going to set these right up on top, and what I'm looking for is I want the black band right here to just go over where the eye is, so that white spot is just right behind where the head's going to be. You could tie these in one at a time if you want to. I just find it's a lot easier to just tie them both in at the same time. Just set them right up here. Roll your fingers down onto them, right onto the side of the head. We're going to get a half a dozen wraps in here to secure them. We'll take a look at the placement. As long as they're running right down along with the wing there, we are good. Trim away the excess here and here, and now go ahead and finish the fly off. We'll make the head starting from the eye, working our way back. You just want to cover up any butt ends of any material. You want to smooth it out, so if you have any dips in the head from the thread wraps and so on, you just kind of want to smooth out the shape. You can flatten the thread out if you like to do the whip finish with the flat thread. It will help kind of lay down into the creases and stuff of the thread and smooth it out a little bit. But we're also going to be putting a number of coats of hardest hull on this to give this a nice smooth glossy finish. Put in about 7 or 8 turn whip finish. And then we can cut our thread. Remove that. Now I like to go ahead and use some Fly-Tite head cement. It soaks right down into the head very well, and it will make all of that really nice and solid. Sometimes even I'll put some onto each stage of the bucktail or something as I'm tying it in. Sometimes that helps. Once that is cured, we're going to go ahead and put a number of coats of hardest hull on that, and then our fly will be done. So the Fly-Tite that we put onto our the head of our fly is all dried and everything, and so now we're going to put our first coat of hardest hull. You could use a lacquer on this if you want. I prefer the hardest hull. It has a nice consistent clear coat to it, as well as that black thread will just show through very, very nice. I find some nail polishes will change colors over time, as well as they'll leach out dyes. They'll get a little discolored. So the hardest hull does not, and it doesn't react with anything, and it just gives it a nice glossy finish. It usually takes 3, maybe 4 coats. Even though the first one that we put on here will look like it's a nice thick coat, it will, when it cures, thin down, and you'll still see thread wraps and everything. So like I said, it usually takes about 3 to 4 coats. Just take your time. Make certain the whole head is covered. It will level itself out, and it'll make a really, really nice smooth head. You can even, I have a number of clips that I use to stand these up and dry, and you can set them at different angles if you want to get that to kind of droop backwards, or to even out a little bit more. But you can also just rotate it in the vise if you want to, and like this, take your time if you're only doing a few of these, whichever you choose. But after that cures, I'll go ahead and put 2, maybe 3 more coats on that, and then it's done. So that's the Little Brown Trout. Interesting fly. I think it's going to do well in streamer season here. You could put a little bit of lead wraps on along the shank if you need a little bit more weight on that, or fish it with a sink tip or like a tungsten leader or something like that. But I just found it an interesting fly. I'm curious to know about the tail, as I mentioned, if I was doing it the way it's supposed to be done, or if anybody even knows that. And then the wing is rather interesting. It's not as straightforward as, say, a Mickey fin or a black-nosed dace, so there was a little bit more involved. It was a fun fly to tie. Thank you for joining me today. hope you enjoyed this video and not only learned a new pattern, but maybe learned some new techniques and a few new skills. If you like this video, please hit that thumbs up button below. You can support Dressed Irons by hitting the subscribe button, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you get notified when new videos are published. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong.